All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're decoding an absolutely monumental shift in clinical documentation. We are unpacking the brand new 2026 AHIMA and ACDIS guidelines for achieving a compliant query practice. If you work in CDI, medical coding, or healthcare compliance, this is your absolute foundation for the new era of query standards.
Here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start with the 2026 framework overview, define key industry terms, unpack substantial compliance, review general query rules, and finish up with standardized criteria.
Moving right along to Section 1, the 2026 Framework Overview, focusing on universal scope and legal significance. So, this new practice brief, it officially supersedes all previous versions. Yep, even those widely used 2022 guidelines. And let's talk about the scope here, because this is a massive takeaway. The 2026 guidelines apply universally. We're not just talking about inpatient hospital care anymore. These standards now carry equal legal and ethical weight across outpatient settings, ambulatory contexts, and even professional fee environments. The oversight of CDI practices has literally expanded across the entire continuum of care. Now, what's super interesting about this framework is how it structures your defense against external audits. It introduces this powerful concept of substantial compliance. Think of it like prioritizing the spirit of the law over the strict, rigid letter of the law. It explicitly states that auditors shouldn't use this brief as some rigid checklist to deny claims based on isolated minor technicalities. Instead, the focus is firmly on the substantive, core integrity of the query itself. A real game changer, right? All right, Section 2, Key Industry Definitions. This is the vocabulary of compliance.
To truly master compliance, we first need to make sure we're speaking the exact same language. First up is query. Basically, a query is a communication tool used to clarify the health record. But here's the cool 2026 twist. A query can be initiated by a human, or it can be generated through computer-assisted automated processes. Whether it's human or AI, if it asks a provider to clarify documentation, it's a query and it falls strictly under these rules. Next up, provider. In the context of querying, the provider is strictly the physician or the qualified healthcare professional who is legally accountable for establishing the diagnosis. So we're talking about the treating clinician who's directly involved in the patient's face-to-face care during that specific encounter, not just an administrative medical director reviewing things later. Then we have encounter, which refers to all patient visit types across both inpatient and outpatient settings. This just reinforces that universal scope we talked about a minute ago, representing the full continuum of care where these query practices actually apply. Now, ambiguous documentation. This is the exact clinical trigger that necessitates a compliant query in the first place. When the chart fails to clearly reflect the provider's intent, and that impacts the clinical scenario or your ability to accurately assign a medical code, well, that's when you have a duty to clarify it. Okay, this next one is an absolutely crucial point for 2026. The definition of a query professional. Obviously, this includes us, CDI specialists and coders. But now, it explicitly includes any vendor or AI technology platform acting in a query-generating capacity. That's right, even the AI bots are legally held to the exact same compliance standards as human beings. No exceptions. Let's talk about clinical indicators. These are your foundational evidence. We're talking about the objective documentation elements. Think lab findings, vital signs, or provider assessments that legally justify your decision to send a query. You absolutely cannot query based on a hunch. You've got to have clinical indicators sourced directly from the record.
Finally, clinical validation. This is the process of making sure a diagnosis that's already written down is actually supported by the clinical indicators in the chart. So if a provider documents a really severe diagnosis, but the labs and treatments just don't reflect that severity, clinical validation means you need to seek immediate clarification. Moving on to Section 3, the Substantial Compliance Standard, Core Requirements versus Minor Deviations. Armed with that vocabulary, let's explore the most important paradigm shift in this brief. What actually makes a query legally sound? Well, here are the 4 unshakable pillars of substantial compliance. First, your query must be strictly non-leading. Second, it has to include clinically relevant indicators sourced directly from the chart. Third, it must absolutely exclude any references to financial reimbursement, denial mitigation, or quality metrics. And fourth, it must allow the provider to exercise their own independent clinical judgment without feeling pressured. And this really illustrates the kind of protection this new framework offers. If you meet those 4 core pillars we just went over, isolated technical deviations, like, say, accidentally missing a source date on a single lab value or some minor formatting quirk, they don't automatically render your query non-compliant anymore. The focus here is on the clinical integrity of the communication, not weaponizing minor typos against you. All right, Section 4, General Query Requirements. Strict rules for Section V execution. Now that we understand the broad protections, let's dive into the strict tactical execution of Section V. Consider this comparison between a compliant and non-compliant title. When a provider opens a query, the title they see cannot contain influencing information. A title like CDI Provider Query Respiratory Status is perfectly compliant because it's completely neutral. But a title like Query for Acute Hypoxic Respiratory Failure is highly non-compliant. Why? Because it leads the provider directly to a specific diagnosis before they've even had a chance to read the clinical indicators. Seriously, never use a directional title. Another crucial point regarding the body of your query is that you have to remain entirely objective. If the medical record states the patient has a heart rate of 120, your query must simply state heart rate of 120. You can't just insert your own subjective wording and call it tachycardia. Remember, query professionals do not diagnose, we just present the raw data. Furthermore, you've got to remember this isn't just an informal chat in the hallway. All compliant queries and the provider's responses must be trackable. They either need to become a permanent part of the health record, or they must be highly retrievable within your organization's official business record. If it isn't documented, it didn't happen, and you certainly can't use it for code assignment.
And finally, Section 5, Embedded Clinical Criteria and Templates, Standardizing Clinical Definitions Safely.
Let's see how this all builds into your daily workflow when using standardized clinical criteria. The 2026 guidelines make it explicitly clear. Embedding criteria like KDGO for kidney disease or ASPEN for malnutrition is perfectly permissible. However, they must be placed neutrally, typically at the very bottom or the end of your template. You can even use hyperlinks to widely accepted criteria, but you absolutely must provide a strict citation of your source. But here is where you have to be incredibly careful with your formatting. You are strictly prohibited from bolding, highlighting, or underlining specific parts of those clinical definitions to steer the provider toward your desired answer. You have to provide the criteria neutrally. The only time you can use bolding or color is if you are directly copy-pasting and preserving the original formatting that was applied by a provider in the health record itself. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final critical question to chew on. Does your organization's query practice still rely on those outdated 2022 checklists? Or have you evolved your templates, your AI tools, and your auditing programs to truly master this new 2026 substantial compliance framework? This shift from rigid technicalities to substantive clinical integrity is a massive win for the industry, but it absolutely requires deep understanding and precise execution. Take the time to evaluate your templates, audit your vendor tech, and make sure your entire team understands these core pillars. Please like, share, subscribe to Decode Health here with Harshal.